Hey, welcome back everybody. This lesson is going to cover how to multiply rational numbers, which is basically just how to multiply positive and negative sign numbers. In a lot of instances, just positive and negative numbers in general. Now, when you multiply rational numbers, there's really just two basic rules. This also follows the same rule when you divide, but that's a separate lesson. But there's two basic rules here. The first rule is this. The product just means the answer to a multiplication problem. The product of different signs, when you multiply two numbers, two signed values with different signs, the answer is going to always be negative. It doesn't matter how big or how small the numbers are. Everything you know about adding and subtracting numbers does not apply to multiplying or division with signed numbers. The product of multiplying different signs is always going to be negative. So a positive times a negative, if they're different signs, is always going to be negative. It doesn't matter how big it is. It does not matter what the absolute value is of the numbers. What matters is if one number is positive and another number is negative, then it's always going to be negative, no matter what. It's always going to be negative. Now, there's a little reminder here. The commutative property also applies to this. The commutative property just states that changing the order of a multiplication problem does not change the product. It does not change it one bit. So whether it's a positive times a negative or, like this, a negative times a positive, it's going to be negative. It doesn't matter. So it's totally commutative. And that's how multiplication works anyway. When you multiply 5 times 6, that's 30, and so is 6 times 5. It's no different. So negative 5 times positive 6, positive 5 times negative 6, doesn't matter, it's going to be negative 30. So positive times a negative or a negative times a positive, or in other words, if they're different signs, then it's always going to be negative. All right, let's go through some examples here to practice this. Now the first example here, and you'll notice in all the examples, they all have different signs. So we're just going to multiply 15 times 4. Now 15 times 4 is 60. And so it's a positive, that's a positive integer, and this is a negative integer. So positive times a negative is always negative. So it's going to be negative 60 as our answer. Now for the next example here, don't be thrown off by this. We have decimals, but we have a negative decimal times a positive decimal. So we have negative 2.8 times 0.4. So negative times a positive, well, you might as well just get that out of the way right now. That's a negative. So we're going to do basically 28 times 4. 28 times 4, like when you multiply decimals, it's okay if you ignore the decimals and then go back to them later. So 8 times 4 is 32. And then 2 times 4 plus 3 is 11. So you got 112. Then what you do is you look at the numbers, and there's a total of 2 numbers that are to the right of the decimal. So that means you're going to move the decimal over 2 places. So there's your answer, negative 1.12. Negative 1 and 12 hundredths. Now next one, we have fractions, but again, the same rules apply. This is a negative, and this is a positive. So negative times positive is going to be negative. So we just put that negative down right away. It doesn't even matter. Well, it does matter what the answer is, but we know at least that it's going to be negative. So now we just have to do 1/2 times 4/5. So 1/2 times 4/5. And if I don't do any cross canceling, I can just multiply left to right. 1 times 4 is 4, and 2 times 5 is 10. And then if you reduce that, you can divide that by 2, and you're going to get 2/5. Oops, I'm running out of room there. So 2/5 right there. So this is going to be negative 2/5. Now remember, when you're putting a negative in a fraction, there's a lot of different places you can put it. You can put it right in the middle, right in line with that vinculum. It's got a crazy name. You can put it right there. So negative 2/5, where it's right in line with that. You can put that negative in the numerator, negative 2 over 5. Or you can put it in the denominator, which is not my preferred spot, but it doesn't make it wrong to do that either. Now this one right here, one thing you might also notice with a lot of these is that I'm showing you different ways to present multiplication. You'll notice that we have right there the binary symbol for multiplication right here and here. And a lot of times we don't like to use x for multiplication, just because when you start introducing a lot of algebra, x is a variable, and you want to get that confused with other things in the problem. Well, this problem right here has two numbers that are grouped in parentheses, and that just is another way of writing multiplication. So this is a negative, of course, times a positive. So a negative times a positive is negative, and 13 times 10 is 130. So that's what we got. I should circle my answers, by the way. And then right here, not to try to confuse you, but I just want to make sure everyone understands this. This is a negative, right? Negative 25. And what is 0? Is 0 negative, or is it positive? So the answer to that question is neither, right? 0 is absence of a sign. 0 has no sign whatsoever, right? It's neither negative nor is it positive. It's right in between the negative and 0 sections on the number line. So there's no such thing as getting negative zeros. That's the reason I kind of put this one on here. You never want to put negative 0 as an answer. That is not correct. So the answer is just 0, the multiplicative property for 0, which is just 0. There's no such thing as positive 0. There's no such thing as negative 0. 0 is just 0. All right, multiplying anything times 0 is going to be 0. Now, multiplying rational numbers, the second rule that you want to follow is that the product of same signs, same positive times a positive and negative times a negative, it's going to be positive. So positive times a positive, as you've always known, is a positive, right? 7 times 8 is 56, right? 3 times 4 is 12. You've always known that since second or third grade, whenever you started learning multiplication with numbers. A positive times a positive is a positive. And then you have a negative times a negative, and this one I know doesn't make a lot of sense to some people, but a negative times a negative, when you multiply a negative times a negative, you get a positive. The same thing, you get positive. I've had a teacher in the past tell me that, it's like you can think of a negative times a negative like a bad thing happening to a bad person. If you think of a really bad person, and a bad thing happening to that person, although that's not a really good rule to follow, we should always think good things happening to people. But if a bad thing happens to a bad person, it's good. It's a positive. I guess you could think of it like that. Or I've heard also the enemy of my enemy, right? An enemy is a negative person, I guess. The enemy of your enemy is your friend. I've heard that used before as well. So that's a good way to kind of visualize or analogize how negative times a negative makes positive, because it's very, very strange how that works out. And then here's some examples. All right, so we've got a positive right here. 45 is positive times 3. So 45 times 3 is going to be positive 105. Now remember, if it's positive, you don't have to put a plus sign in front of it. It does not make it wrong either to put a plus sign in front of it. You just don't need it. It's always inferred. If it's just 105 and there's no sign in front of it, we can always assume that it is positive. Now this is a negative times a negative. So we're going to do 0.54 times 0.12. So you should be able to do this. So let's do 54 times 12, really. And that's going to be 8. That's 10. And then when you add everything up, that's an 8, that's a 4, that's a 6. And then look at the problem here. How many numbers are past the decimal? There's 1, 2, 3, 4. So there's 4 numbers to the right of the decimal. So that means you're going to want to move the decimal over 4 places. So 1, 2, 3, and what do we do about that 4th place? Well, we have to annex a 0 on there. We have to put a 0 there. So put the 0 there, and there you have it. So put the 0 there, and then you've got 0.0648. And the math technical way of saying it would be 648 10,000ths. 10,000ths with a TH. 648 10,000ths. The lazy, non-mathematical way, but the way that everyone says it anyway, would be 0.0648. Okay, on the next one here, we're just multiplying a negative times a negative, and these are just fractions. Now, when we're dealing with fractions, we can cross-cancel. It's like cross-reducing. So we have the same numbers here diagonal from each other, so those turn into 1s. And then 3 and 15 can both divide by 3. So 3 divided by itself is 1. And 15 divided by 3 is 5. And then, like we said, This is a negative times a negative, so it's going to be positive. We don't have to put a positive sign if it's positive, but I'm just going to put that there just to emphasize that it's positive. So 1 times 1 is 1, that's our numerator, and then 1 times 5 is 5. So we got 1/5. Now this one right here, we got a negative again. We have a negative times a negative, and we got what? That's a positive, right? So this is one of those weird examples that I'm kind of showing you here. But 1,000 times 2,000. 1,000 times 2,000 is actually 2 million. Positive 2 million. Now, a couple special situations right here. Now, the examples that I just did, what I started out this lesson with, we were just talking about 2. You know, when you're multiplying a positive times a negative or a negative times a positive, it's going to be negative. So when you multiply a negative times a positive, or if you multiply a positive times a negative, that is going to be negative, right? And if you're multiplying a positive times a positive, or if you're multiplying a negative times a negative, that is going to be positive. But remember, that only applies to 2 numbers, right? A positive times a positive. So it always throws people off when there's more than, 2 numbers in the problem. Well, the key is that when you do these problems, you just want to work them out left to right. So just go left to right and just kind of do 2 numbers at a time and just follow those same rules. And there's another way too to talk about it, and I'll talk about that at the end. But let's just do 2 numbers at a time. So positive 2, right? That's a positive, times a negative 1. Well, that's going to be negative 2. So negative 2, I'm going to drop everything else down the way it is. Negative 3 times negative 10. And then just do 2 numbers at a time. Now this time around, we're doing a negative, negative 2 times a negative 3, which is going to be positive 6. You don't need to put plus 6, but I'm just doing that to emphasize that it's positive. Drop down the times negative 10. And now we have just 2 more numbers to multiply. And these have the different signs. So it's a positive times a negative, which we know is going to be negative. And then 6 times 10 is 60. So you got negative 60 right there. Now the other thing that some people do is they'll look at the problem, this is all multiplication, and they'll look at the number of negatives, and they'll count. All right, there's 3 negatives. There's an odd number of negatives. Well, we know that an even number of negatives will always make a positive, right? But there's this one leftover negative here that's kind of left out. It doesn't have anybody to pair up with. So that means our answer has to be negative when you're all done. So some people, when they do this, they'll count the number of negatives. If it's odd, they know it's going to be negative. If it's an even number of negatives, they know it's going to be positive, because whenever you pair up 2 negatives, they always make a positive. So like right here, I just wrote a whole bunch of negatives and just count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We have 8 negatives, which tells us that should be positive. So those two pair up and make a positive. Those 2 pair up, make a positive. Those 2 pair up, make a positive. And those 2 pair up to make a positive. There are no more negatives left, so that is going to be positive. So that's a way to kind of do it. All right, on this one too, we can kind of follow that rule we just learned and count the number of negatives. So we have 1 negative right here. That's 2, that is 3, and that's 4. So we have 4 negatives, which tells us we should get a positive outcome. We should get a positive product for this answer. So let's go ahead and do this left to right. So negative 5 times negative 3 is positive 15. And then I'm going to drop everything else down the way it is. Times negative 1 times 2 times negative 4. And just go 2 at a time here. I can put this in parentheses as well. So 15 times negative 1 is negative 15. Drop down the 2, drop down the times negative 4, and then keep going. So negative 15 times 2 is negative 30. Drop down the negative 4, and then our little experiment here works because we have a negative times a negative, and a negative times a negative is a positive, and so we've got 30 times 4, which is 120, which supports what we were saying earlier, that it's going to be positive. So 120. Remember, like I said, though, if it's positive, you don't need to put a plus sign in front of it. Just writing 120 is fine. If you write plus sign, that's also okay, and that works out. Okay, so that does it for your lesson on multiplying rational numbers. Everyone have a great day. See you later.